Small Gods may be my favorite Discworld novel, but Interesting Times comes to a close second. Once again, I make the distinction between favorite and best because while my enjoyment of Interesting Times is quite great, it is also quite personal. I think Neil Gaiman put it best when he said,
"So this is the color of magic. It's a romp, and it's a terrible place to start. It's like trying to understand P.G. Wodehouse by beginning with his school stories. And it's a collection of jokes, and in the color of magic, they aren't even very good jokes."
And who am I to argue with Neil Gaiman? I mean, he's much richer and more successful than I'll ever be. But to truly put Interesting Times into perspective, you kind of do need to start with the color of magic. Indeed, that's rather the whole point of Interesting Times. To explain what I mean by that, though, let me pose a hypothetical. Have you ever been to a place? Maybe for just a day, maybe for several years, but long enough for you to have precious memories of it. And then years pass, and you go back to that place because of all those precious memories. But now something is different. The place hasn't changed. Even after all this time, it's still exactly as you remember it, and every corner and path is just as it was when you were first there. But you're different. You've changed. You've grown and become a different person than the one who made those memories, and because of that, the place itself is now different. How does this relate to Interesting Times? Well, to answer that, we first need to ask, what is Interesting Times? Interesting Times is the story that gets Rincewind, Twoflower, Cohen, and their luggage back together for one last adventure. But unlike Sourcery, which was done at the behest of fan demand, this time Sir Terry sets the story on his own terms, and the result is a significantly better work. Rincewind is enjoying a rare moment of peace and tranquility after his adventure with Eric, when he is suddenly whisked away to the Agatean Empire on the counterweight continent at the behest of the mysterious Lord Hong. You see, there's this new tract going around Agatea called What I Did on My Holidays, which has inspired a revolutionary furor among the populace. And given how this tract makes frequent references to a great wizard, two Z's, whoever holds that wizard will surely win the political game that is unfolding. However, unbeknownst to any of the mortal players, the gods themselves are playing their own game, and Rincewind has Lady Luck on his side. How does the world of Interesting Times work? While a prototype was briefly mentioned in Soul Music, Interesting Times marks the first proper appearance of Hex, a magically powered supercomputer that is used to track down Rincewind and will be used multiple times throughout the rest of the series. Like most early computers, it's a piece of junk that breaks down frequently and is usually more trouble than it's worth. But it's Ponder Stibbons' baby, and the other wizards at Unseen University don't know what to do with it, so it stays. Meanwhile, while Cohen the Barbarian had appeared in earlier books, this marks the first appearance of his entourage of other aged barbarians, the Silver Horde. They run into Rincewind fairly quickly after his being teleported to Agatea because, as luck would have it, they've decided to conquer the place. While the Silver Horde blazes a trail across the country, though, they slowly start to realize that they really are the last of the old-time barbarian heroes still on the disc. With all the others either dead or retired, Cohen and his gang start to wonder if maybe this whole civilization thing could offer more than they assumed. The civilization, though, as represented by the Agatean Empire, has its own issues. The rich and powerful lord it over the oppressed masses, and education and social mobility are so tightly restricted that the common people don't have any knowledge on how to change things. And the nobles with consciences don't have any knowledge of the world outside their political theories and palatial homes. While Agatea is a mishmash of various Asian cultures, it draws most of its inspiration from the late Song and Qing dynasties in China, and in particular the idea of Qing solipsism and decadence. This is one of those historical narratives that persist to this day because it was in the best interests of both British imperialists and Chinese communists to promote it. And it's with that that we get to the major problem of Interesting Times. It's not the most racially sensitive book. Now, I'm not here to accuse Terry Pratchett of racism. I never knew him personally, and unless he used his wealth and platform to actively promote anti-Asian discrimination, then it's not really my business what he thought behind closed doors. But I can say with surety that the Discworld is a very white world. Part of this has to do with its foundations. Discworld started out as a parody of popular fantasy in the 80s, and even after Pratchett started incorporating parodies of other non-fantasy works, the world remained rooted in the media that Sir Terry grew up with as a baby boomer in rural England, which I think we can all agree was pretty overwhelmingly white. I mean, come on, it's England. That's where they make white people, for crying out loud. So, my issue with this then isn't so much that Discworld's main cast is mostly white. Even if we spend most of our time in the European Stowe Plains, Pratchett makes it plain that there is a whole world out there, with a plethora of different cultures and kingdoms that we do visit in several Discworld books. But because there is not the same level of a fantasy canon for non-European countries available in English, instead of making parodies of fiction from these places, Pratchett bases the portrayals of lands outside the Stowe Plains on fiction about these places. Works like The Arabian Nights, The Secret Doctrine, or The Asian Saga. In other words, he's basing his Agatean Empire on works written by outsiders looking in, without noticing that many of these outsiders bastardize, bowdlerize, or even outright lie about their subject matters. Well, Pratchett always made it a point to scrutinize the historical revisionism of figures like Gerald Gardner or Margaret Murray. No such scrutiny is lent towards figures like Lobsang Rampa or James Clavell, despite their credentials being just as flimsy, if not more so. Even the title, Interesting Times, comes not from an actual Chinese saying, but from an urban legend made up by Europeans. And this is the main issue. There are no elves or trolls or dwarves in our world, but there are Asian people, and by basing his fantasy characters on these real people, or at least on a bastardized version of them, the joke shifts away from isn't this trope or cliché funny, and more towards aren't these people funny. You'll recall Mort, or Sourcery, how the main joke of the Clatchian characters was how they were overly superstition, or they had strange customs, or they talked in a funny way. That's the main thrust of the humor with Agatea and Interesting Times, just how weird and foreign it is. Even if there is a kernel of historical truth in Agatea, the place itself is a parody of a bastardization, to the point where the kernel of truth actually makes the whole thing worse. If someone says, "Now look here, Mrs. Penny, elf ears are not vaginal, thank you very much," the response from most people will simply be, huh? Because we know that elves are pure fantasy, and with fantasy, you can make up whatever rules you want. But if you base a story on history, then suddenly you need to put in some extra effort, because you never know what agenda your historical sources might have had, or what assumptions your readers might make about that history when they read your story. Pratchett does not put in this effort with Interesting Times, and that is the problem I have with it. Despite this, though, I am willing to go to bat for Interesting Times and say that it avoids the worst pitfalls of this type of pseudo-historical fiction through some subtle but important plot points. Firstly, while Cohen and the Silver Horde might resemble the classic tropes of the barbarians at the gate or the white hero who becomes better at ruling a non-white country than the native folks, just like with the real-life Mongol hordes, Cohen and his gang don't successfully conquer any civilization until they adapt to that civilization's rules. It isn't brute barbarian strength that saves the day, but the Silver Horde learning Agatean strategy and getting Agatean equipment, and then using that against their Agatean foes. Also, while Cohen and the gang may end up conquering a kingdom, it's made clear that they'll need the help of reform-minded Agateans to actually administer anything. The Silver Horde then becomes not a conquering force that overwrites Agatea, but something which forces the Agateans to adapt and learn. More importantly, though, and where I think Interesting Times truly shines, is in how Pratchett handles the other historical event which inspires the plot, the Chinese Communist Revolution. Interesting Times may not present Asian people in the most flattering light, but the common people were a subject very near and dear to Pratchett's heart. Like I said, he grew up in post-war rural England, and he has fond childhood memories of time spent on pre-industrial farmland. So, while the peasantry of Agatea may not look much like actual Chinese commoners, they do resemble English farmers, and Pratchett uses them to explore the message of Interesting Times. That, of course, begs the question, what does Interesting Times have to say? Interesting Times is a story about change, and more specifically, how human beings can fail at it even when they make a genuine effort. Things need to change in Agatea. The rich and powerful and the poor and downtrodden are only growing more so with each passing day, and even if the system is going to collapse under its own weight at some point, no one makes a move against it because they don't believe that change is possible. Thanks to the publication and dispensation of What I Did in My Holidays, though, a whole new world of possibility has been opened up to the Agateans, and a revolution has begun with an organization known as the Red Army. However, Rincewind notices a problem with this revolutionary movement. Despite being for the common people's sake, the Red Army's organizers are all noble lords and ladies, and while their movement is just, they have no real idea how to put their theories into practice. Like Lilith Weatherwax from Witches Abroad, the moment their expectations clash with reality, the Red Army will not know how to adapt. And while the new government may be different from the old one, and may make different mistakes, the end result will be more of the same, with the common people not being that much better off in the long run. You can't build a revolution for other people. The best you can do is give those people the tools, knowledge, and ability for them to make things better for themselves. And even then, real, lasting change takes more time and effort than a lot of people are willing to put in. Most oppressive regimes endure because the people are apathetic, rather than cowed into submission. But even despite this, simply scoffing at revolutionary movements and their empty theories does more harm than good. Rincewind's selfish cynicism is shown as just as harmful as the Red Army's naive idealism. Because while the latter may create a new oppressive regime, the former only lets the old oppressive regime continue. As with small gods, you need to find some place in between cynicism and idealism, to keep your anger sharp and focused, not on the supposed cause, but the desired effect. And if you do that, then maybe, just maybe, the world will become just a little bit better. Final verdict. While the message of Interesting Times is engaging in and of itself, what truly makes the book special are the characters who convey it. Rincewind, Two-Flower, Cohen, and the luggage. The same gang from our very first adventure in Discworld is back after 15 books, and they are just as we remember them. Not one bit of their characters have changed, and as soon as they meet up again, they're back to bickering and bantering just as they were when we first met them. But even if they haven't changed, Discworld has. What started out as a simple parody of fantasy cliches has morphed into its own fantasy world, just as rich and influential as Middle-earth or Earthsea. More than that, though, Pratchett's very conception of fantasy had changed. A bit before Pratchett started work on Interesting Times, he put out an anniversary edition of his very first novel ever, The Carpet People, and upon revisiting it, he had this to say. Hang on, I wrote that in the days when I thought fantasy was all battles and kings. Now I'm inclined to think that the real concerns of fantasy ought to be about not having battles, and doing without kings. Even if this is just another adventure for Rincewind and the boys, it doesn't feel anything like The Color of Magic or The Light Fantastic, because Pratchett, his world, and the stories he wants to tell have fundamentally changed. They've grown up, and the difference is as stark as that between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. This is why Interesting Times is my second favorite Discworld book, because it was the moment that I looked back on the Discworld series and realized that it is a reflection of Terry Pratchett himself and his own journey through life. It's honestly rather unique for an author to put out a single series of books at a consistent pace throughout their life, and for that series to grow and change with the author. and yet that's precisely what Discworld is. And while most readers would recommend you skip the early installments because they're clunky and awkward and stack up poorly next to Pratchett's later work, Interesting Times shows that you can't really appreciate growing up unless you can look back on your younger self and realize how far you've come since then. Of course, the Asian jokes demonstrate that Pratchett still had some growing up to do, and they're enough for me to bump Interesting Times down to a 9 out of 10. If they're enough for you to pass on the book entirely, I can't really blame you for that. But even so, I can't help but love this book. Revisiting it makes me realize just how far Discworld has come, and how far it still will go. So for now, I'm Marc, signing off, and I hoped you liked this video. If you did, and you'd like to see me make more, please leave a like or comment down below, share my video via Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or other means, and subscribe to my channel. Also, if you'd like to help this channel out, I now have a Patreon, which you can contribute to via the link in the description. If you sign up, you'll get sweet bonuses like an internet hug, early access to videos, and the ability to vote in polls to help me decide which works to cover next. Thank you all, and I will see you in the next one.